All right, we are back to talk about some of Callimachus's amazing work. So we are going to start with the Ode to Zeus. Now, what is an ode? Homer, or the Homeric tradition, had a series of long-ish, but not epic length poems, maybe 4 to 5 pages in a document today, of odes to different gods. The most famous of which are the Ode to Demeter, which I'm going to talk about in a bit, but also, if you're looking for something to read over the summer, he has this amazing, has an amazing ode to Hermes, which is very funny and interesting. And he has odes to Apollo and different gods. So Callimachus is deliberately taking the form of an ode, which is essentially a poem of praise, and he is creating new ones that are much more polished and refined, and they're less fun to read because they are less about stories and more about demonstrating the depth of Callimachus's knowledge. But they also highlight some elements of Hellenistic kingship and Alexandria in particular that I thought would be interesting for this course. So I'm asking you to read the entire ode, but especially with the Ode to Zeus, definitely just skim it and focus on what we're talking about in this lecture. Because the ode itself, as you will find, is full of place names. There's a lot of descriptions of ancient places. And part of the reason Callimachus is probably doing that is to demonstrate his own familiarity with places in Greece, which would not be natural to him because he never, as far as we know, actually lived in Greece proper. He might have visited, but he spent his life in Alexandria. So by creating a poem in which he's like, what about this place in Greece and this place in Greece and this place in Greece, he's demonstrated kind of his bona fides, as we say, his legitimacy as an heir to Homer. And it's boring for us because we don't have that same, oh, you have to know about this place and this place to be cool. Like that's just, I mean, we just don't have that. So it's a kind of boring read when it's like describing all of these groves. But what I want us to emphasize in the Ode to Zeus is Callimachus's portrayal of kings, because this is very unique to him. But of course, as we know already, having learned so much about Alexandria, it's very familiar to an Alexandrian audience. So, Callimachus starts off his ode by saying, what song but of Zeus for the gods' libations? Eternal Lord, eternally great, mythic scourge of the sons of heaven, lawgiver to the mythic scourge to the sons of earth, lawgiver to the sons of heaven. So here's Zeus is being portrayed both as himself, eternal, great, mythic, etc. But notice that Callimachus is emphasizing the fact that Zeus is a scourge of the sons of earth. This means bane or like enemy of the sons of the earth. In the concept of the poem, the sons of the earth are the Titans, which was the generation of gods that Zeus defeated. But also in the context of Alexandria, you might argue that Zeus as king is similar to Ptolemy as king, and Ptolemy of king as king was the conqueror in part of many peoples outside of Alexandria. So by emphasizing Zeus's role as a kind of warlike commander, he is also highlighting Ptolemy's role as a successful military leader. And thus amplifying and legitimizing the idea of the king of spear-won lands. So you may remember that from the Pillars lecture, that the way that Ptolemy and other Hellenistic kings justified their rule was by saying that they had won their land with a spear, as opposed to being like connected to that land through lineage. So here too, by emphasizing Zeus's success as a military commander, he's legitimizing that as a basis of power. But also, Zeus is called a lawgiver to the sons of heaven. This would be his, the fellow Olympians, his brothers and sisters, and all the other gods. In the same way, Ptolemy and all other Hellenistic kings were considered lawgivers, legitimate kings who ruled effectively over their subjects, essentially. So that's the beginning. And then immediately, Callimachus goes on to talk about where Zeus was born. And it's this very interesting kind of um, he raises a question only to answer it, essentially. So Zeus has disputed nativity that divides the mind and doubt. So was Zeus born on the Cretan hills of Ida, or was he born in Arcadia? So the Cretan hills of Ida are on the island of Crete. Arcadia is in the Peloponnese. It's a land-based thing. And both of those places, Crete and Arcadia, claimed that Zeus had been born there in earlier times. Why would they have done that? Because it makes them feel more powerful, right? Like Zeus was born here. We're an amazing place. And so Callimachus asks, of these claimants, which has lied, Father? And then Callimachus quotes this very famous phrase, Cretans are always liars. The quote itself is something like, a Cretan man says, Cretans are always liars. And it's this sort of paradox. If a Cretan is always lying, and the Cretan man says, Cretans are always liars, is he telling the truth? Like, if he is lying about Cretans always lying, then is he saying that Cretans are always so it's this paradox. We don't have to worry about it. It's not my favorite thing to think about. Um, but Callimachus is quoting it here just as a way of laying claim to this ancient paradox, saying, "Hey, I know this ancient thing." It'd be like throwing in the Pythagorean theorem or something to prove you're good at math. And so then he says, "And your Cretan-built tomb, my lord, will never hold your immortal essence." So Callimachus raises the question, the problem, where is Zeus born? These two very different places in Greece have said that he was born there. So thus he points out that there's confusion among Greek speakers about where Zeus is born in Greece. And then he says, even though there's a tomb for you in Crete, it will never hold your essence. So it doesn't really matter where you were born because your essence is everywhere. And this is very important in Alexandria. It's a way of saying, yes, we don't have Zeus's tomb here, but who cares? We're Alexandria, right? Zeus is everywhere. Zeus is here. He does not exclusively belong in Greece proper. So it's a way of legitimizing Alexandria. But also notice the idea of a tomb of Zeus. Callimachus can't help but be reminding his people, his readers, that there is a tomb in Alexandria. It doesn't hold Zeus, but it does hold the very real body of Alexander. And that is indisputable. It might not hold Alexander's immortal essence, but the tomb, the Soma in Alexandria, holds Alexander's body. So it reminds the reader of that fact and of Alexandria's connection to Alexander, who was this great son of Greece. So it's all very kind of there. I hope that makes sense. So then Callimachus goes on to say, and this is a separate section. He goes on and he talks about whatever land, giving birth, whatever, all this stuff. And then he goes on to contest, Callimachus does in the Ode, the idea that was common in Greek mythology, which is that Zeus, Hades, and Poseidon all chose their realms by lot, by chance. So like one day, Greek poets would say, the three brothers, Zeus, Hades, and Poseidon, basically sat down and threw dice to see who would be king of all of the earth, who would be king of the ocean, and who would be king of the underworlds. This is a very commonly held belief. But Callimachus does not think that that's something that we can believe happens. And he says, old poets, including Homer, lie when they say that the lot assigned triplicate homes to the sons of Zeus. Who would play dice for Olympus and Hades except a green novice? The stakes should be equal for a gamble like this. These were whole worlds apart. A poet's fiction should at least be plausible. So he's arguing that, of course, Zeus didn't play dice to see if he would be the ruler of Olympus, which is the earth, or Hades, because Hades is disgusting. Like, who would want to be king of Hades? Callimachus doesn't say it, but he implies who would want to be king of the ocean? There's no people there. It's all fish and like sea monsters. So he's saying Zeus would never have been on equal level with his brothers. He was always better. There's no idea, there's no thought that he has his power by chance. It was always his power because he was always the best, is what he's arguing. And in a way, he's supporting kingship here. So a king doesn't get his power through an equal or random process like democracy. A king is just naturally better, just like Zeus is naturally better. So that's why a king is king. It's not just like he's equal to other people and he got the role by chance. He deserved it. He was naturally better. That's why he is king. So democracy doesn't apply at all. Just like here, democracy wouldn't have applied to Zeus. Chance wouldn't have applied to Zeus. And then the line, a poet's fiction should at least be plausible. Callimachus works on this idea of plausibility. He won't write anything that's too outrageous. He leaves that for the big books. His work is very modern, very reason-based. And so then he goes on, and finally, towards the end, he gets to his final, last, very obvious praise of kings. So we say, blacksmiths belong to Hephaestus, the god of the forge. Mercenaries, those soldiers we talked about, mercenaries belong to Ares, the god of the bad kind of war. So that's kind of an interesting connection, but we don't have to worry about it too much. Hunters belong to Artemis Chiton. Artemis was the god of the hunt. And to Apollo, those who strum tunes on a lyre. So Apollo was the god of musicians. But kings are from Zeus, and there is nothing more divine than God's own lords. So this is praise. This is praise of Ptolemy, whether it be Ptolemy one, Ptolemy two, or all the Ptolemies. This is flat out just like kings are the best. They're better than everybody. And they come from Zeus. So just then Callimachus ends his poem by praying to Zeus and saying, dispense goodness and wealth, which is very unique. Homer would never talk about wealth, but here is wealth. And Callimachus is just like, we need both goodness and wealth. We can't live on goodness alone. Wealth without goodness is a worthless increase. So people who have money but aren't good are bad. And goodness needs substance. In order for goodness to thrive, it needs wealth. Bless us with both, Zeus. So it's a kind of cynical end to the poem. Like, let me be good, but let me also be rich. But it's very straightforward, you know? So that is the end of the hymn to Zeus. I do not think there is a Homeric hymn to Zeus. There may well have been, but it doesn't exist. But this is it's a hymn to Zeus, but it's also a hymn to kings, which is perfect for an Alexandrian poet who is living in a library supported by the king. Okay, so the next poem. Now, this is the poem I will admit, part of me just wanted you to read this because I think this is such a funny, interesting poem. But I love the Hymn to Demeter by Homer, which is very good. And if you ever take my myth class or have taken my myth class, you will know that I spent an entire lecture talking about the Homeric Hymn to Demeter. But mainly, I just love Callimachus's version because it's disgusting and amazing, and it gives you kind of a nice slice of life in Alexandria, what it's like for a woman, which is very rare. But so here's some background. In the Homeric hymn to Demeter, we learn the story of Demeter and Persephone that everybody, if you know a story about Demeter and Persephone, it is the story that is told in the Homeric hymn. And that is the story that Persephone, the daughter of Demeter, was kidnapped by Hades and forced to marry Hades and live in the underworld. When that happened, Demeter went mad. She wandered the earth for many months. There's a brief little interlude where she becomes a nanny to a child and tries to make him immortal. That doesn't work out, and so then she sends a plague to the earth until she is reunited with her daughter. When Demeter and Persephone are reunited, we find out that Persephone has eaten either a or some pomegranate seeds, and as a result has to live with Hades for part of the year. So if you know that story was told first by Homer in the Homeric hymn, and it is beautiful. Callimachus does not tell that story at all. Not at all. He doesn't have to. He knows that his audience knows that story. So he doesn't even really mention Persephone. Instead, he focuses on this very crazy story about a bad boy who gets a terrible punishment. But he starts off the poem. So I'm asking you to read the poem. It's very short. I think it's worth reading. The beginning is a little bit tough to get through because in the beginning of the poem, he is just describing a festival. So we talked about festivals when we talked about Athens and how Athens had all of these festivals. These festivals were still going on. There was a version of them in Alexandria, and that is what Callimachus describes at the beginning of the poem. When he says, chant as the wicker moves in procession, hail, great Earth Mother, Lady of Grain, chant, O my sisters, but if you are not an initiate, watch from the ground. He's describing a procession of women going through the streets of Alexandria. So he's describing the actual Thesmophoria, the grain festival that celebrates both Demeter and Aphrodite when he tells the sisters who are not initiated into the cult to watch from the ground, it's because in the procession, the women are carrying baskets and wagons full of secret articles that if you they don't want non-initiates to see by watching from an elevated space. So that's what's going on there. It's very technical and very boring, frankly. The beginning is very boring, though it's nice to have women's voices. Where it gets interesting is when Callimachus is like, I'm not going to tell you the same old story about Demeter. We don't need to rehash Demeter's suffering. Let me tell you about this kid. And his name is pronounced Eriskthon. Eriskthon. It's very annoying to pronounce. It's actually easier to read in Greek just because the way the vowels look. But anyhow, Eriskthon is a bad boy. And he violates this grove of trees that was sacred to Demeter. So in this place in Thessaly, I think it doesn't really matter. It was in Alexandria, but there's a sacred grove of trees, full of trees, and this kid, Eriskthon, comes and starts cutting down the trees with his bad boy friends. So Demeter at first is very measured in her response to the destruction of her trees. She comes to him disguised as a human being, which she also does in the Homeric hymn to Demeter. And she comes to him as a priestess and is very nice to him. Like she's giving him a chance, right? And she says, my child, why are you cutting the trees of the gods? Stop this, my son. Your parents hoped better for you. So this very kind of nice approach, and the mention of the parents is very poignant given what happens. But Eriskthon does not listen to this old lady. So we see this disrespect, and this is again why I want this Heckley poem so bad, this disrespect of women. And we see it described here. He looked at her with a scowl more ferocious than a birth-raw lioness gives to a hunter. Out of my way, or I'll bury this axe in your chest. So can you imagine? It's just some kid threatening a priestess, woman, old lady with an axe. Like it's insane. Like how intense he gets. He clearly is a very bad person. An ugly speech from the lad, and Nemesis duly recorded his words. So in English, we have the word nemesis as enemy, right? In ancient Greece, there was this goddess Nemesis. Now notice this is a statue of her here. Notice that she's standing on someone. So Nemesis was the goddess of retribution. She's a little bit like the Furies, actually, that we met in the Eumenides. She's in charge of a form of justice, not quite justice, but like getting even. She's amazing. There's not enough work done on Nemesis. There's not a lot of material on Nemesis. My argument is that she's a goddess kind of for women, and so the men just didn't talk about her very much, but that's my theory. Anyhow, but so Nemesis writes down the bad words of Eriskthon because he deserves retribution, and he is going to get it from Demeter. So now Demeter's anger transcended speech. She had been in the body of a priestess, whatever, remember, and so she was the goddess once more. Her feet firm on Terra, which is land, her head level with Olympus, which is a mountain. So she becomes very, very tall. And this is a very funny joke, I think, about gods in mythology. They can dress up as humans, and they often do. And Demeter does in the hymn to Homer as well here, in the Homeric hymn as well as she does here. And in both the Homeric hymn and here and in other poems, when they want to become gods again, they show that by becoming very, very tall because they're gods, they're huge. So in the Homeric hymn to Demeter, She's in a house, and when she stands up all of a sudden, and Homer, it was like her head hits the ceiling. So that's how in that poem we know she's very tall. Callimachus takes it a step further and has her feet on the ground, but her head up in the mountain. So like way bigger than the Homeric hymn. So she's definitely back in her goddess form. The men were half dead with fear when they saw the grim lady and ran away. These are the friends of Erisichthon. And then Erisichthon remains and she addresses their ponderous lord. This would suggest that he was a little bit overweight, which is going to pay off in a minute. Oh, yes, yes, you dog, go build a hall for feasting with friends. Your feasts will come fast now. So this is like, it's great. It's just it's ironic and cruel in a way that's unique. And so this is the punishment. And with these words, she wrought Erisichthon's doom, infecting him with a virulent hunger, a caloric morbidity. Now, this word caloric is from our translator. The Greeks didn't know about calories, but there's another Greek word that's just more boring. A caloric morbidity, an astringent disease that puckered his innards, an appetite unabated no matter how much he ate. So I was really tempted to make a reference to the Stephen King book slash movie called Thinner here, where this was essentially the plot, except for in the movie Thinner the guy I think wanted to lose weight anyhow, but the pictures were too disturbing. I am too old and sensitive now to have scary movie pictures on my slides. So, but the idea is that no matter what this kid eats, he's hungry, hungry, hungry all the time, but no matter what he eats, he can never be sated, and he starts to become quite sickly and sick. But here actually is my favorite part of the poem because we get this picture of home life and what it's like for parents and children, which is very rare for Greek poetry. It's just this almost domestic space that's really unique, and especially because it's incredibly relatable. Because what happens is the parents love their son, their stupid, evil son, and so they keep feeding him everything they can, but they're embarrassed by how much he's eating and also by the fact that he's still also wasting away and getting sick. And so they just, when people come to their house and say, hey, can Erisichthon come out and play? They have all of these elaborate excuses trying to hide their kind of personal problems from the greater view. So that's what's being described. His mortified parents invented every excuse not to send him to dinner parties. He's not home. He just went to Cranon to collect a debt of 20 oxen. Or another excuse, Erisichthon, a boar wounded. Sorry, there should be boar. I'll change it. Um, and excuses like this. And then the mother, the poor woman, loved her son. Why shouldn't she lie? Like that image of a mother's love for her son causing her to lie to her friends, I feel like is just very resonant and nice. And then the dad is also really concerned. So the dad of Erisichthon claims to be the son of Poseidon. So here he's going to Poseidon, his father, and saying, why aren't you helping me? And he says, the father of Erisichthon says to Poseidon, some patriarch you are. Look at your grandson. Better Apollo should shoot him and I lay him to rest. Sorry about the typo. Blame it on the wind. If we pause here for just a second, this just to show you how Callimachus not buries, but like embeds a bunch of other different mythological traditions into the big stories that he's telling. The story of Apollo killing children is a reference to another myth called the Niobe myth. And there was a woman named Niobe who had, I think, 7 sons and 7 daughters. The number could be wrong, but there's equal number of sons and equal number of daughters, and there's a bunch of them. And Niobe starts bragging that her kids are so amazing, and that Niobe herself is better than Leto, the mother of Apollo and Artemis, because Leto only had 2 children and Niobe had 14. And so Leto gets very upset about this, and she goes to her children. She's like, I got 2 great kids, but this woman is bragging. And so Apollo goes and kills all of the male children of Niobe, and Artemis, his twin, goes and kills all of the female children of Niobe. And then Niobe herself turns into a rock. She just sits down and sobs forever and turns into a rock. So this idea where a father is going to Poseidon and saying, "I wish Apollo would shoot my son, it would be better," is a reference to that myth. So the father calls Eriskthon an ox eater. He says, "My pantries are exhausted, my stables are empty," because he's eating the horses. "My cooks have all quit. He's eaten the mules, the cow, the war horse, even the cat. And such a mouser he was." So just a little bit of humor. Not that I think dead cats is funny, obviously, but I just thought it was a very funny little line at the end. And so finally, this is not the end, but this is the end of the story. The king's son was reduced to sitting at crossroads, which is the worst place you can sit. In the ancient world, the crossroads was for criminals and sex workers. It was a very bad place. So the king's son was sitting there, begging for crusts, leftovers, and garbage. And then Callimachus says, "May I never be friends with your enemies, goddess. May no wall unite us. I loathe bad neighbors. Seeing maidens, hail, great Earth Mother, Lady of Grain." And then it returns to the Thesmophoria. So it's such a funny story. I hope that you thought it was funny. I also love the idea that at the end, it might just be kind of a critique of bad neighbors. Like maybe Callimachus had a next door neighbor with like a bad kid living next door. Like the "I loathe bad neighbors" is very funny to me. Anyhow, I hope you enjoyed it. Or if you didn't enjoy it, you can kind of see your way to getting there, or like why it's actually pretty good. But if not, that's totally okay. So let me pause this, and then when we come back, we will look at some very sad and then some very funny epigrams, and we will ponder our mortality before leaving Alexandria forever. So come back for that. It won't be that sad.